There are books that report a crisis, and there are books that argue about what the crisis even is. Richard Sakwa's Frontline Ukraine, published in 2015 as the conflict in the Donbass was still raw and the wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 still smoldered in the public memory, belongs firmly to the second kind. Sakwa, a professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent, set out to write the first full account of how Ukraine came apart in 2014, and in doing so, produced one of the most controversial interpretations of the affair in the English language. This is a summary of that book, taught in my own words, an education in its argument rather than a reproduction of it. The thesis that organizes everything Sakwa writes is deceptively simple and deeply contested. He argues there were really two crises tangled together. There was a Ukrainian crisis, the internal struggle of a young, divided state to define itself between its western and eastern regions, between competing visions of nationhood. And there was a Ukraine crisis, the geopolitical contest in which that internal struggle became hostage to a larger confrontation between Russia and an expanding Atlantic security order. Untangle these two, Sakwa insists, and the events of 2014 begin to make sense. Conflate them, as he believes most Western commentary did, and you get a morality play instead of an analysis. What follows is the case he builds, chapter by chapter, in the order he built it. A reader should know going in that Sakwa writes against the grain of the dominant Western narrative, and that his book has been both praised for its analytical nerve and sharply criticized for leaning too sympathetically toward Moscow's reading of events. I will represent his argument as he made it. Judging it is the reader's work, and the book itself is the place to do that work. Countdown to confrontation. Sakwa opens by refusing the comfort of a single villain. The war that returned to Europe in 2014, he argues, was not the product of one mad decision in one capital, but the accumulated weight of 2 decades of missed exits. He sets the conflict against the centenary of 1914 deliberately. The year the book's events unfold is 100 years after Europe last sleepwalked into catastrophe, and the parallel is meant to unsettle. The danger in his telling is not malevolence, but momentum. Structures and assumptions built after the Cold War that made a collision steadily more likely, while everyone insisted they were keeping the peace. The core distinction is introduced here, the one the whole book rests upon. The internal Ukrainian crisis concerned the character of the state, how to reconcile a population with genuinely different historical memories, languages, and orientations. The external crisis concerned the architecture of European security after 1991, and specifically what Sakwa sees as the failure to build an order that included Russia rather than one organized against it. He names the post-Cold War settlement an asymmetrical end to that conflict. The West understood itself to have won and built institutions on that premise, while Russia never accepted that it had lost in the way a defeated power is expected to. From this follows Sakwa's central interpretive move, the contrast between what he calls the wider Europe and a greater Europe. The wider Europe is the EU and NATO expanding outward, an order that grows by absorbing new members into existing structures whose terms are set elsewhere. The greater Europe would have been a continental order of equals, a Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, in which Russia was a founding partner rather than a problem to be managed. Sakwa's claim is that the road not taken was the greater Europe, and that its abandonment is the deep cause of everything that followed. What lingers after this opening is the sobering recognition that catastrophes are rarely chosen outright. They are arrived at, step by reasonable seeming step, by people convinced their own conduct is defensive. There is wisdom here older than any of the policy debates Sakwa surveys, the understanding that prudence, restraint, and the humility to imagine how one's own actions appear to others are not soft virtues, but the very things that keep nations from the abyss. Their absence, not the presence of some singular evil, is what he is tracing. 2 Europes. Building on that foundation, Sakwa turns to the deeper question. How did 2 visions of Europe come to stand against each other, and why did one swallow the other? He distinguishes between the European Union as a civilizational project, the cultural and historical inheritance of a continent, and the EU as an expanding institutional and geopolitical bloc with its own bureaucratic logic and security entanglements. The tragedy, in his account, is that the second increasingly spoke in the name of the first, so that disagreement with Brussels's enlargement agenda could be cast as hostility to Europe as such. He traces how the European project, conceived in part to transcend the bloc politics of the 20th century, came paradoxically to reproduce them. The EU's Eastern Partnership and the logic of association agreements presented neighbouring states with a choice framed as civilizational destiny, but functioning as geopolitical alignment. For a country like Ukraine, poised between two economic and security worlds, this framing was not an invitation, but a forced decision. And a forced decision is precisely what a genuinely plural Europe should never have required. Here, Sakwa develops his argument about how the enlargement of Atlantic institutions ceased to be experienced as the spread of peace and prosperity, and began to be experienced from Moscow as encirclement. He does not ask the reader to endorse the Russian view. He asks the reader to understand that it was held, sincerely and consequentially, and that a security order which dismisses how it appears to a major power is building instability into its own foundations. The substance of an order, he suggests, cannot be separated from how that order is received. The insight worth carrying from this chapter is that an institution which expands by requiring others to choose sides has already abandoned the universalism it claims. A genuine community of nations honors difference. It does not demand assimilation as the price of belonging. The promise of a Europe of distinct peoples and traditions, each with its own dignity, is quietly betrayed the moment Europe becomes a single bloc that one must join entirely or be counted against. Sakwa's two Europes are, at bottom, two different answers to whether nations may remain themselves. Ukraine contested. With the European frame established, Sakwa narrows his lens to Ukraine itself, and here he is at pains to dismantle a caricature. The country, he argues, was never simply a nation straining against Russian domination. It was a genuinely plural state, the product of borders drawn and redrawn across centuries, containing populations with real and divergent senses of who they were and where they belonged. To understand 2014, one has to take that internal plurality seriously, rather than flattening it into a single national will. He sketches the competing models of Ukrainian nationhood that had contended since independence in 1991. One vision was monist, a unitary Ukrainian identity, anchored in the Ukrainian language and a particular reading of national history, to which all citizens were expected to assimilate. The other was pluralist, a civic and bilingual Ukraine that made room for its Russian-speaking East and South as full participants rather than incomplete Ukrainians. Sakwa's sympathies lie with the pluralist model, and he argues that the gradual ascendancy of the monist vision, especially after 2014, did real violence to the country's actual composition. He walks through the regional textures that made Ukraine what it was. The Galician West, with its Habsburg and Polish memory, and its intense national consciousness. The Russophone industrial east of the Donbass, bound to Russia by language, labor, and family. Crimea, with its overwhelmingly Russian population and its singular history. The great pivot of Kiev in the center. These were not obstacles to nationhood, in Sakwa's reading, but the raw material of it, a nationhood that could only succeed if it embraced its own complexity rather than legislating it away. What this chapter teaches is that a nation is not an idea imposed from above, but an organic inheritance grown from soil, memory, language, and locality. The attempt to manufacture unity by suppressing real difference, to make a people into a project, runs against the grain of how genuine communities actually cohere. Ukraine's tragedy, in this light, was the temptation to resolve its plurality by decree, rather than to honor it through patience and federal accommodation. The deepest loyalties are local before they are national, and a state that forgets this courts the very fracture it fears. The February Revolution. The narrative now arrives at the rupture itself. The Maidan and the overthrow of President Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014. Sakwa offers a deliberately disenchanting account of events that much of the Western press rendered as a clean democratic uprising. He does not deny the genuine popular grievance against Yanukovych's corruption and misrule, nor the real idealism of many who stood in the square. But he insists on complicating the heroic story by attending to what else was in the crowd, and what the outcome actually was. He emphasizes the role of organized radical nationalist factions within the protest movement, groups whose ideological lineage he traces and whose influence, he argues, was disproportionate to their numbers at the decisive moments. He examines the collapse of the February 21st agreement, brokered with European foreign ministers, that would have kept Yanukovych in office until early elections. Within a day, that agreement was overtaken by events, and the president fled. For Sakwa, this sequence matters enormously. What could have been a negotiated transition became, in his framing, an extra-constitutional seizure of power, however popular its impulse. The consequence, he argues, was that a government came to power in Kyiv that significant portions of the country, particularly in the east and in Crimea, regarded as illegitimate from its first day. The revolution that one half of Ukraine experienced as liberation, the other half experienced as a coup against the president they had elected. This perceptual split in Sakwa's analysis is the hinge on which everything afterward turns. The annexation of Crimea and the Donbass rebellion become intelligible not as bolts from the blue, but as reactions to a rupture in the country's constitutional order. The lesson Sakwa draws, quietly, is an old conservative one: that the manner of change matters as much as its content, and that legitimacy, once broken, is ruinously hard to restore. Even a corrupt ruler removed by means that shatter the constitutional order leaves a wound that justice cannot easily close, because the precedent set is that power flows from the street rather than the ballot. Lawful, patient reform is slower and less thrilling than revolution, but it preserves the one thing a divided society cannot live without: a shared agreement about how power may rightfully be held. Break that, and force rushes in to fill the vacuum. The Crimean Gambit. From the rupture in Kyiv, Sakwa moves to its first great consequence, Russia's seizure of Crimea in March 2014. He presents the annexation as a calculated and opportunistic response rather than the first move in a premeditated campaign of expansion. The distinction is central to his whole book. He reads Moscow's action as fundamentally reactive and defensive in its own logic, a grab to secure the strategic naval base at Sevastopol and to forestall the peninsula's drift into a hostile alliance, rather than as evidence of a program to redraw the map of Europe by conquest. He situates the move in Crimea's particular history, its transfer from Russia to Ukraine within the Soviet Union in 1954, its overwhelmingly Russian population, the long-standing presence of the Black Sea Fleet. Sakwa argues that in the eyes of the Russian leadership, the change of government in Kyiv threatened arrangements they regarded as vital, and that the speed and relative bloodlessness of the operation reflected how thoroughly the ground had already been prepared by sentiment and circumstance. He addresses the referendum and the disputes over its conduct, presenting the contest of interpretations rather than resolving it by fiat. Sakwa is careful, and this is where his critics part company with him most sharply, to frame the annexation within international law's competing principles. The tension between territorial integrity and self-determination, the precedents invoked and the precedents ignored. He does not pretend the seizure was unproblematic. He argues that it was comprehensible, that it followed a logic, and that treating it as motiveless aggression forecloses the analysis before it begins. What emerges here is a sober realism about how great powers behave when they perceive vital interests at stake. States do not act from sentiment, but from interest, and a foreign policy built on the expectation that a major power will calmly accept strategic loss on its own doorstep is not idealism, but negligence. This is not an endorsement of any seizure of territory. It is the recognition that the world is composed of distinct powers with distinct vital concerns, and that a stable order is built by accounting for those concerns rather than by pretending they will evaporate under moral disapproval. The wise statesman studies how the world is, not how he wishes it were. When history comes calling, Sakwa pauses the forward narrative to widen the historical aperture, and this chapter is where he most fully develops the long view behind the crisis. The confrontation of 2014, he argues, was the return of unfinished business, the bill come due for the way the Cold War ended. He revisits the 1990s and the promises, understandings, and resentments that accumulated around NATO's eastward movement. The bombing of Yugoslavia, the recognition of Kosovo, and the steady erosion of Russia's sense that it had a place in the European order rather than a place outside it. He develops the theme of the asymmetrical settlement at length, because the end of the Cold War was understood in the West as a victory rather than a mutual emergence from confrontation. The institutions of the victors simply expanded into the space the Soviet collapse had vacated. There was no new architecture, no Congress of Vienna for the late 20th century that might have integrated the former adversary into a stable balance. Instead, there was enlargement, and enlargement carried with it, Sakwa argues, an implicit triumphalism that Russia experienced as humiliation deferred rather than reconciliation achieved. History, in his telling, does not stay buried. The grievances of the 1990s, dismissed at the time as the grumbling of a defeated power, returned with compound interest when Russia recovered its strength. What looked from one side like the peaceful spread of democratic institutions looked from the other like the methodical advance of a hostile alliance toward the heartland. Both sides, he suggests, were acting within stories that made their own conduct righteous and the other's conduct menacing, and neither could see how its own behavior confirmed the other's worst fears. The truth this chapter circles is that nations, like persons, cannot escape their memories, and that a peace which humiliates rather than reconciles is no peace at all, but a postponement. The victor who mistakes triumph for the end of history sows the seeds of the next conflict, because the defeated do not forget, and dignity denied does not dissolve, it waits. A settlement that endures must offer even the vanquished a place to stand. This is statecraft as the oldest wisdom understood it, that magnanimity is not weakness, but the only durable foundation of order. The Novorossiya rebellion. The narrative resumes with the uprising in the Donbas in the spring of 2014, as the contagion of Crimea spread to Ukraine's southeast. On the 1st of March, Sakwa recounts thousands gathered in Donetsk under Russian flags and the banner of a hitherto unknown Donetsk Republic, and what some hopefully called a Russian spring soon hardened into something far grimmer. He examines the revival of the imperial-era term Novorossiya, New Russia, and the separatist movements that took up arms against Kiev across Donetsk and Luhansk. Sakwa resists both of the simple stories on offer. Against the Western account that the rebellion was simply manufactured in Moscow and staffed by Russian agents, he argues that it drew on real local grievance, real fear of the new Kiev government, and real regional identity that predated any Russian involvement. Against the Russian account that it was a pure and spontaneous popular rising, he acknowledges the inflows of fighters, weapons, and direction from across the border. The reality he describes is a hybrid, an authentic local revolt that became progressively dependent on and shaped by outside support as it militarized. He is attentive to the tragedy within the tragedy. How a movement that began with genuine grievances about language, autonomy, and the legitimacy of the new order was captured by maximalist factions and external agendas, and how the Kiev government's decision to answer the rebellion with military force, the anti-terrorist operation, converted a political crisis into a war that would grind on and kill thousands. Each side's hardening confirmed the others, and the space for the federal compromise Sakwa favored narrowed toward nothing. What this chapter quietly mourns is the destruction of organic community by the machinery of ideological conflict. The people of the Donbas, their factories, their families, their particular and rooted way of life, became raw material for a contest of grand abstractions waged over their heads. There is a deep human cost when distant centers of power, whether in Kiev, Moscow, or the West, treat a living region as a piece on a board. The local, the particular, the inherited bonds of place and kin, these are where real life is lived, and they are the first things crushed when nations decide to settle their quarrels through the people caught between them. Worlds in collision. Sakwa now turns to the catastrophe that internationalized the war and froze the lines of conflict. The destruction of Malaysia Airlines, Flight 17 over eastern Ukraine in July 2014, with the loss of all 298 aboard. He treats the disaster as the moment the regional war became a global crisis, the event that hardened Western opinion into certainty and made compromise politically impossible. He examines the rush to attribution, the politicization of the investigation, and the way the catastrophe was absorbed into the larger narrative context almost before the evidence could be weighed. More broadly, this chapter is about the collision of incompatible information worlds, the way the same events generated entirely separate realities in Western and Russian media and politics, each internally coherent, each dismissing the other as propaganda. Sakwa argues that this epistemic fracture was itself a strategic fact, not merely a regrettable byproduct. When two sides no longer share a common ground of fact, diplomacy loses its footing because there is no agreed reality within which a settlement can be negotiated. The collision of worlds was a collision of narratives that had become impervious to each other. He situates the sanctions regime, the military build-up, and the diplomatic ruptures that followed MH17 as the consolidation of a new confrontation. Not the Cold War returned in its old form, but a new and in some ways more dangerous standoff, lacking the stable rules and mutual comprehension that the original had eventually developed. The tragedy of the airliner became the occasion for locking in positions that prudence might otherwise have kept open. The reflection this invites is on the peril of a world that has lost any shared standard of truth. When competing powers inhabit sealed narratives, each certain of its own righteousness, the possibility of reconciliation depends on something rarer than information. It depends on the humility to suspect one's own account, and the recognition that the adversary, too, is acting from within a story that seems true to him. Without a shared reality and the patience to seek it honestly, nations talk past each other until only force remains to settle what reason no longer can. The restoration of truth-telling is not a luxury of peace, but its precondition. Frontline politics. In the penultimate movement of the book, Sakwa pulls back to assess what the crisis had made of the wider international order and of the participants' domestic politics. He examines how the confrontation reshaped politics inside Russia, inside Ukraine, and across the West, how external conflict consolidated power, marginalized dissenting voices, and rewarded hardliners on every side. The front line in his analysis was not only the trench line in the Donbass, but a fault line running through the politics of every state involved. He is sharply critical of the role he assigns to the United States and to NATO's strategic culture in escalating rather than containing the crisis. He revisits his argument that an order organized as the projection of one bloc's power, rather than as a genuine balance among powers, generates the very resistance it then points to as justification for its existence. The confrontation, in his reading, served institutional and political interests that had outlived their original Cold War rationale and found in the new standoff a renewed purpose. Sakwa surveys the failed and partial diplomacy of the period, the Minsk agreements and the difficulty of implementing them, the gap between the ceasefires signed and the war that continued. He argues that the structural conditions for a settlement were absent precisely because the larger relationship between Russia and the Atlantic Order had never been placed on a stable footing. The frontline politics of the moment kept generating reasons not to settle, because settlement required concessions that domestic politics on every side had made unspeakable. The enduring point here concerns the corrupting effect of permanent enmity on a nation's own soul. A state organized around an external adversary tends to hollow out its internal liberties, to silence the voices counseling restraint, and to mistake the interests of its security establishment for the interests of its people. There is a profound case for the older vision of the nation that minds its own affairs, keeps its commitments modest, and resists the temptation to define itself by perpetual confrontation abroad. For empire, whatever its banner, exacts its heaviest price not on its rivals, but on the character and freedom of the people who maintain it. The future of Ukraine. Sakwa closes the main argument by turning to what might yet be salvaged, and the chapter is as much warning as prediction. He lays out the possible futures branching from the wreckage of 2014, a Ukraine that doubles down on the monist, militarized westward-only path, a Ukraine that finds its way back to some federal accommodation honoring its plural composition, or a Ukraine condemned to remain a frontline, a fractured borderland whose internal divisions are perpetually inflamed by the external contest, never permitted to heal because too many powerful interests are invested in the wound. His own counsel is unmistakable even where it is not stated as advocacy. He believes Ukraine's only durable future lies in recovering the pluralist, inclusive, bridge rather than frontier vision of itself. A neutral or non-aligned Ukraine that could serve as a meeting point between East and West, rather than a battering ram for either. He argues that forcing the country to be the outermost rampart of one bloc against the other dooms it to permanent instability, because it asks Ukraine to suppress half of its own identity in service of a geopolitical contest it did not choose. He returns, finally, to the two crises distinction that opened the book. The internal Ukrainian crisis, he argues, is in principle soluble through federalism, constitutional accommodation, and respect for regional difference. But it cannot be solved as long as it remains hostage to the external Ukraine crisis. The unresolved confrontation between Russia and the Atlantic Order. Heal the larger relationship, and Ukraine might heal itself. Leave the larger confrontation festering, and Ukraine remains its battlefield. The hope Sakwa permits himself rests on the conviction that a nation is healthiest when it is allowed to be fully itself, in all its inherited complexity, rather than conscripted into someone else's crusade. The future worth wanting for Ukraine is one of organic reconciliation among its own peoples and peaceable relations with all its neighbors. A future of rootedness rather than rupture. That such a future seemed to be slipping away, even as he wrote, is the quiet grief running beneath his analysis. Afterward, the challenge of transformation. In closing, Sakwa lifts his gaze from Ukraine to the whole structure of the international order, and frames the crisis as a symptom of a transformation the West has not yet found the wisdom to accept. The unipolar moment that followed the Cold War, he argues, is ending, and the real challenge is whether the order built on that moment can adapt to a world of multiple centers of power, or whether it will fight that transformation and, in fighting it, make the transition far bloodier than it needed to be. He returns to his deepest theme, that the way the Cold War ended planted the seeds of the new confrontation, and that the task ahead is to build the inclusive, pluralist European and global order that was not built in the 1990s. The alternative is a continued effort to preserve a dominance that the underlying distribution of power no longer supports, an effort whose cost will be measured in crises like Ukraine's, repeated and intensified. Transformation, he insists, is coming either way. The only question is whether it is managed with prudence or resisted into catastrophe. The thought on which the book finally rests is one of sober realism about a world of genuine and irreducible difference. The peoples and civilizations of the earth will not be melted into a single order on a single set of terms, and the attempt to force them is the surest road to conflict. A peaceable world is a plural world, one that honors the distinct identities, traditions, and sovereignties of its members rather than demanding their dissolution into uniformity. The challenge of transformation is, at bottom, the challenge of accepting that others are permitted to remain themselves. Taken whole, Frontline Ukraine is an argument that the catastrophe of 2014 was neither inevitable nor the work of a single aggressor, but the harvest of a quarter-century's failure to build a European order capacious enough to include everyone it claimed to have liberated. Sakwa's gift is to make the reader see the crisis from more than one vantage at once, to hold the genuine idealism of the Maidan and the genuine fear of the Donbass in the same field of vision, to grant that an order can spread peace and provoke war by the same motion. Whether one accepts his conclusions or resists them, the book teaches the reader to distrust the morality play and to ask the harder questions about how nations actually behave and why. What you carry forward is a habit of mind, the refusal to mistake your own side's story for the whole of reality, and the recognition that durable peace is built by honoring difference rather than abolishing it. It should be said plainly that this is a contested book, and that Sakwa has been criticized for granting Moscow's perspective more sympathy than his critics think it has earned. A fair-minded reader will want to test his account against the strongest opposing histories of the same events. But that is exactly why it rewards reading in full. Sakwa's prose, his command of the regional detail, the texture of his argument, and the force of his central distinction between the two crises cannot be conveyed in any summary. They have to be encountered on the page, weighed against the counter-arguments, and judged by the reader's own lights. If the questions raised here matter to you, read Frontline Ukraine. Crisis in the Borderlands by Richard Sakwa in its entirety. It will sharpen your thinking, whether you end up agreeing with him or arguing with him the whole way through.